A lot of what this channel does is show how, if you look at history through the Christ centered view of the narrative in early Genesis, then things make a lot more sense. Early Genesis fits with history a lot better, fits with science a lot better. And I'm going to do that on a small thing here today. I've done it on this channel on some big picture items, but now I want to take a very small picture item. There is a thing called the Sumerian Kings List. It's an ancient record written on either clay tablets or clay pillars from long ago that purports to give the reigns of kings in Sumeria, including kings that it says reigned before the flood swept over. There are 8 kings with cities. There were 5 cities. There were 8 kings that sort of held the kingship, and they said the kingship descended from heaven, and they reigned before the flood swept over. And the lengths of their reigns, according to the scholars who give their best translations, are just crazy long. The first of these 8 kings, they translate, reigned 36,000 years. The longest reigning king reigned a little over 43,000 years. I believe 43,000 years. And that's just, the others also reigned over 10,000 years, all of them, all 8. And that's just wildly too long. So they understand, the scholars understand, maybe we're translating this wrong. And they are. But they haven't found a way to translate it that makes sense because they're not doing 2 things. I'm going to do the 2 things here. We're going to solve the mystery of the reigns of the pre-flood kings on the Sumerian kings list here in about 5 minutes of your time. Now, let's start with how they get the translation. The main unit for the pre-flood kings, not the post-flood kings, but the main unit there is what we call in English a sar. A sar is the unit they use in the Sumerian kings list to define the reigns of the kings. And sar is not a unit of time. It's just a numerical unit. It is a numerical unit used in astronomy, or it was used by the Sumerians in astronomy. And that kind of makes sense because they thought that these kings had a divine origin, and so it makes sense to use an astronomical term, and also they had very long reigns anyway. So it makes sense to use an astronomical term to describe the reign, but it doesn't answer the question of what unit of time you put with the number. Sar means 3,600. So this king reigned 10 sars. The longest reigning king reigned 12 sars. But what is the unit of time that goes with sar? The translators have assumed years, but I don't think that's right. And they have failed to consider, or actually they have considered it, but they've rejected it for a bad reason. The idea that a sar, the unit that should go with that, should be days. If it says a king reigned 10 sars, that means he reigned 10 periods of 3,600 days each. And in that time, because you say, Mark, that's kind of a weird way to measure it. It wasn't for that time. They didn't have the 365 and a quarter day years that we have today. What they did was they had a lunar year of 354 days and a 360-day year of 12 30-day months. And then they would have a festival or something later when they noticed the sun and the moon were getting a little off, and they'd have a festival of a certain period of time to reset things. But a typical day was 360 days, or excuse me, a typical year was 360 days when it wasn't 354 days. So a SAR would simply be a 10-year period in their 360-day years. Now, if someone reigned for 10 SARs or 12 SARs, like the longest reigning king on the Sumerian kings list, if each number was a year, that would be 36,000 years. That would be an incredibly long length of time. But if it was a day, they'd say, well, maybe they meant day there. Let's put that in. No, that's still too long because they reigned 3,600 days times 10. That's almost 100 years. That's 100 years of 360 days each. It's not quite 100 of our years because our years have 365 days, but it's almost 100 years. And that's too long for a king to reign. Even the longest reigning king, he reigned 120 years of 360-day years. And they say, well, we can't translate it like that because that's still too long. So we're going to leave it years and assume they grossly exaggerated. No. That's the second part of the mystery. They are not taking seriously the lifespans recorded in Genesis chapter 5 and Genesis chapter 11. And you say, well, Mark, they shouldn't take those seriously because those lifespans are just crazy long too. They're not 36,000 years, but the idea that humans lived 800 years, even 500 years, it just seems ridiculous. Well, it does seem ridiculous if they're claiming that's the lifespan that everybody had. But if you see my narrative on the lifespan of the patriarchs explained, I have another video where I say the lifespans of the patriarchs explained, and I show you how the Bible is not claiming that everybody lived that long. It's claiming that there was a divine group of people, the descendants of Adam, that lived that long. When the Lord God was with them, before the flood, when he was there with them every day, walking among them, administrating for them, healing them of diseases they didn't know they had, that group of people had exceptional lifespans. And as soon as, after the flood, he quit coming down. He wasn't with them all the time. And the lifespans, each generation, started dropping dramatically. And that's what the Bible really teaches about it. So, of course, when we find fossils and we estimate their age, we don't find any that lived 800 years. We shouldn't expect to. There weren't many of these folks, but there were some. And if you just consider that, if you just consider, even if it's the line of Cain, the lifespans of his descendants apparently started dropping as soon as he left the presence of the Lord God. If you go to Genesis chapter 4, Cain has 7 generations, when Seth's descendants only go down 3 generations. You see, the lifespan of Cain's descendants were dropping even before the flood, once he was expelled from the Lord's presence. But were they still exceptional? Yeah, they were still exceptional. So what if Seth's descendants lived 2.5 times longer than Cain's descendants? That's still a long time. Because if Seth's descendants lived 800 years, Cain's descendants could easily live 300 years and still account for that ratio in Genesis chapter 4. Well, if, let's say, some of them came down the Tigris and Euphrates River and became kings because they had a lot of advantages, set up their own system, and had gathered people to them, like Cain did with the city that he built, and according to Genesis, they could live for hundreds of years even before the flood. So if they had a reign of 100 years or 120 years, that's not really a big deal. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Some of you are thinking, but Mark, it's ridiculous to think that any humans lived 800 years or 350 years. Is it? Well, let me ask you this. When futurist Albie de Grey, about 10 years ago, came out and said that the first person who will have a 1,000-year lifespan has probably already been born. He said that a few years ago. Did you scoff at him? Can you recall any scientists or scholars who scoffed at him, came out in public and said, this guy's full of gas? You recall anybody saying that? No. No, you don't. The scientists think there's no problem believing that they can give people lifespans of 1,000 years. They just don't think God can do it. So is that a problem of the evidence, or is that a problem of the heart? Is that a problem of the will? It's a problem with the will, my friends. All evidence is a mirror. You see, it says as much about you as it does about whatever subject it's supposed to be talking about. So, regardless of how you think about that, the plain fact is, if they would just translate the unit with SAR as day instead of year, the Sumerian pre-flood kings would have reigns consistent with the range you would expect from the lifespans listed in Genesis 5 and in particular the Genesis 11 genealogy table. That's it. In other words, it fits together. It fits together better. If they have a better explanation, let's hear it. But it's been decades, and all they've given us is they claim these people had reigns of 36,000 years. Okay, and I don't think they were claiming that. I think it's another data point showing that it was common. The lifespans attributed in Genesis, chapter 5 and chapter 11, that it was commonly understood in the area around Eden that there was a group of people who had those lifespans. Anyway, I want to put that out there. It's a small thing. There are many other bigger issues I deal with on this channel and show how if you reinterpret Genesis through the lens of Christ, it explains these things a lot better. I do appreciate you listening, and may God bless you.